So our next speaker is Kellan Warner. Kellan previously worked for natural history museums as an informal science educator, dedicating her 20s to making science more accessible to communities who are typically underrepresented in the sciences. She came to the MAS MBC program to focus her career on marine conservation and gain new skills in the field to equip her as an ocean conservation leader. While whales are her first love, this program has exposed new passions for marine policy and fisheries, and her Capstone project allowed her to explore these arenas in more depth. I have observed that Kellan loves cetaceans. She knows a lot about whales and has a strong resume on whales. I'm telling you, if you have questions about whales, Kellan is your person. So it would have been easy for her to play small and safe without pushing outside of her comfort zone, but she didn't. Instead, she pushed hard, and I bet that was uncomfortable, but you wouldn't know it. Kellan went all in on seafood imports and found a new love for policy. I love it when that happens. And she aced that too. So now I can safely say that if you have a question about whales or US seafood imports, well, Kellan is your human for both of those topics. The name of her project is Sink or Swim, the sustainability story of US seafood imports.
Thanks, Samantha. In the week following its release, the recent documentary Seaspiracy was one of the top 10 films on Netflix in the United States and other countries. The film explores different facets of the seafood industry with a varying degree of accuracy. The film came to the conclusion, spoiler alert if you haven't seen it, that sustainable seafood doesn't exist and everyone should stop eating seafood products. I myself did not eat seafood for much of my adult life, even though I love it. Not because I didn't think sustainable seafood existed, but because I didn't know how to find out what is sustainable. From how it's caught, to where it's caught, to what's being caught, it's a complicated issue. But even if all fishing is bad, which it isn't, commercial fishing is going to persist to fill nutritional and financial needs of people worldwide. So how do we support sustainable fisheries and help change fisheries to conduct sustainable practices? First, let's talk about the seafood industry at large. The seafood industry encompasses both aquaculture and wild-caught products and is an economic powerhouse worth $151 billion, and it employs 39 million people worldwide, according to FAO numbers from 2018. To compare it to another industry that we might have some more familiarity with, the coffee industry in 2017 was worth $83 billion and employed 25 million people. So seafood wins. Seafood fills a substantial nutritional role as well worldwide by providing about 3.3 billion people with almost 20% of their average per capita intake of animal protein. And here in the US, residents eat an estimate 19.2 pounds of seafood annually, and we are the second largest consumer in our country of seafood after China. To use our favorite coffee example again, in 2019, the US imported 4 billion pounds of coffee. In the same year, we imported 6 billion pounds of edible seafood. So once again, seafood wins. But because U.S. fisheries can't supply the demand for every U.S. citizen to eat almost 20 pounds of seafood, of their favorite seafood, almost every year, we have to rely on imports. In fact, of all the seafood consumed in the United States, 65 to 85% of it comes from imported sources. Of our domestic seafood, it's regulated by 3 major pieces of legislation. The first is the Magnuson-Stevens Fisheries Conservation and Management Act, or the MSA for short. The MSA was originally intended to protect U.S. waters from foreign fishing fleets and set the boundary of national waters to 200 nautical miles offshore. It also established 8 regional fisheries management councils tasked to create fisheries management plans to comply with 10 set national standards. My one whale picture is for the MMPA, or the Marine Mammal Protection Act, which was created to protect marine mammal populations and ensure their preservation through measures such as take reduction plans, species permitting requirements for interactions with the species, and monitoring through frequent stock assessments. Through the MMPA, the United States is also mandated to attempt to influence international standards for marine mammal interactions. The third member of our trifecta is the Endangered Species Act, or the ESA, which also significantly impacts U.S. fisheries and mandates special precautions and protections for species on the endangered species list. NOAA currently manages over 165 marine species that are either endangered or threatened, and the ESA outlines several ways to manage them, including the development and implementation of recovery plans, designation of critical habitat, and close monitoring, and once again, data collection on the status of the species. This led me to ask myself a question. If we hold our domestic fisheries to the standards of the MSA, the MMPA, and the ESA, but we're eating 65 to 85% of our seafood from imported sources, how sustainable is the majority of seafood that Americans are eating? To answer this question, I used data from the Monterey Bay Aquarium Seafood Watch program to investigate U.S. imported wild-caught seafood to determine both the current status of sustainability and the limiting factors preventing fisheries from achieving a higher rating in the Seafood Watch scoring system. So Seafood Watch uses performance-based metrics to assess fisheries based on a predetermined set of criteria, and that helps them come up with an overall rating score. These 4 criteria that inform the overall rating are Criterion 1, impacts on the species under assessment, Criterion 2, impacts on other captured species, and this is the criterion that covers bycatch, and bycatch just means anything that's caught that the fisher didn't intend to catch. Criterion 3 is management effectiveness, and Criterion 4 is impacts on the habitat and ecosystem. So I analyzed almost 900 wild-caught fishery ratings that were created between 2016 and 2020. And I used a similar methodology as a previous study in 2015 by Pelk et al. And I assessed U.S. domestic fisheries by first grouping, and I did both domestic and import just for comparison's sake. So I assessed domestic and import fisheries by first grouping fisheries by overall rating, and then calculating the mean numerical score for each overall rating group to reveal some potential scoring patterns. To illuminate trends in the data and criterion scoring, I also examined gear type, region, species group, and bodies of water in relation to the ratings. Seafood Watch reports provided detailed information, which helped me understand some of the justifications of scoring and helped me understand maybe some of the limiting factors. All right, let's get into my results and look at some graphs together. So this pie chart shows the overall rating percentage for the U.S. domestic fisheries. Nearly 75% of all U.S. domestic fisheries are rated as good alternative, or yellow, that large yellow piece of pie. This seafood comes from sources that align with most of Seafood Watch's guiding principles. However, there might be one area that they really need to work on or some significant uncertainty about the impacts of the fishery. So if you think of it like a stoplight, yellow is our yield. Be a little cautious, maybe go, maybe don't, maybe eat the seafood, maybe don't. It depends on the situation. 15% are rated as avoid, or red slice in the pie. And avoid seafood comes from sources that really just don't meet the criteria and have some significant uncertainty and a lot of things that need to improve. There's a critical conservation breakdown and concern. So for our stoplight, that's stop, don't eat that seafood. And 12% achieve best choice, or a green score. And seafood rated as best choice scores well in all the criterion and is well managed, and the stocks are doing well. So if stoplight, you go ahead and eat that seafood. For U.S. import fisheries, over 65% are rated as avoid, our large red piece of pie. About 27% are good alternative, medium yellow piece of pie, and only 6% are best choice, which is the green slice. And when we compare the two charts to each other, the difference is really striking. When I talk to my friends and family about this project, inevitably they ask me how sustainable their favorite seafood product is. As I mentioned before, it's nuanced and complicated, and I am by no means an expert in the field, but the biggest piece of seafood advice that I've taken away from this project is U.S. domestic seafood is rated better generally than U.S. imports. And because such a large percentage of the import fisheries were rated as avoid, I wanted to take a closer look at the criteria and subfactors that led to that rating, and those scores in particular. So I calculated the percentage of best choice, good alternative, and avoid scores for each criterion within the avoid rating group for both U.S. and import fisheries. So this slide has two tables. On the left are the scores for impacts on other captured species, and has the percentage of U.S. and imports for comparison. On the right is the same, but for criterion 3, which is management effectiveness. I only included information from these criteria just because it's where the patterns in scoring are the most illuminating. So criterion 2 shows very similar scores for the U.S. and imports, both with scores of 90% or higher. And that is noted in the lilac oval. And then the scores diverge in criterion 3, which is management effectiveness. And that's where it gets really interesting, where 87% of import species are rated as avoid, and only 44% of our U.S. have the same rating. And so that's noted in the magenta oval. I also decided once again to zoom out to look at the entire pie by examining the overall scoring patterns without considering the assessment scores that the fisheries eventually achieved. So don't think about the slices, just think about the circle. This graphic accounts for all US domestic fishery ratings and highlights what the criterion scoring percentages revealed. US fisheries are limited by criterion 2, which is bycatch. And this goes along with the findings of the Pilk et al. Paper from 2015 that I mentioned earlier. For all import fisheries assessed, criterion 2 was also overwhelmingly rated as avoid, but we also see that avoid score very high in management effectiveness. This shows that for US import fisheries to become more sustainable and to earn better Seafood Watch assessment scores and move from being majority avoid to becoming majority good alternative, there needs to be work done both in bycatch and management. So what does this difference in scores look like? And how could fisheries maybe improve the score, particularly in management? So tuna, let's look at a case study of tuna longline fisheries. Tuna are highly migratory species and are managed by regional fisheries management organizations, or RFMOs. An RFMO is an international body made up of countries interested in the management of fish stocks in a particular region. US tuna fleets are under the jurisdiction of RFMOs. Get excited for another graph. So when we compare US imported and domestic tuna longline fisheries to each other, we see a stark difference in how they are scored. 100% of imported tuna longline fisheries score as avoid, and only 12% of US tuna longline fisheries earn that same score. The majority earn a good alternative. And when we look at the criterion scores, we dive a little deeper for these fisheries. 100% of import fisheries score red in both bycatch and management effectiveness, whereas US fisheries score 100% red in bycatch, but they're yellow in management effectiveness. Why? What accounts for that difference? Well, while under the jurisdiction of RFMO, US fleets also must adhere to US litigation. This is really important because general RFMO bycatch mitigation mandates for tuna longline fisheries are fairly loose, and a good example for comparison is observer coverage. Fisheries observers, as Allegra mentioned, collect data on what the fishery is actually collecting and can also collect data on if mitigation measures are working. RFMOs require fisheries to aspire to up to 5% observer coverage, whereas US tuna longline fisheries require 20% to 100% observer coverage, dependent on region and species targeted. Stricter management leads to a higher score in the Seafood Watch system. So there are three main takeaways from my project. Seafood can be sustainable, and we saw that in the green slices of the pie, so sorry, Seaspiracy, you're wrong. And consider supporting fisheries that are working to be more sustainable and be part of the story of creating an international fishing system that's dictated by science and is focused on ocean preservation. And finally, bycatch and management of fisheries are global issues that need to be properly addressed for the long-term sustainability of our fisheries and oceans. Thank you so much to Seafood Watch for the usage of your data, to my amazing committee, including my chair, Dr. Sarah McDonald, for her unending enthusiasm and guidance in this project, to my committee members, Dr. Mark Jacobson and Corey Ridings, for their fantastic input and support. Thank you also to Robin Pelk for meeting with me to discuss the 2015 paper that inspired this work, to Sam Wilding from Seafood Watch for brainstorming new ways to look at the data, to my family and friends for listening to me talk about seafood way too much, and to the MAS faculty, staff, and my incredible cohort who, while resilient, is also so much more. Thank you.
Oh, it looks like we have a question in the audience.
Kellan, are you going to start eating seafood? Kellan, will you start eating seafood?
Start any seafood?
Yeah.
Yes, I eat a little bit. I worked in Maine for a little while doing whale stuff, and I had friends who were lobstermen, and they let me eat lobster that they caught, and it was incredible. So yeah, usually if it's someone I know that caught it, I'll eat it.
Kellan, this is a question we've got from the web. This is going to require you to have a little bit of a crystal ball. Do you think the marine mammal import provisions of the Marine Mammal Protection Act will help with the bycatch and management issues that we see?
It depends. Our favorite answer to all questions.
Where did you learn that answer?
I think the intent, of course, I believe, I didn't write it, but you would think that marine mammal import provisions, and for maybe those who don't know, the point of these provisions is to make sure that imported seafood is held to the same bycatch standards as domestic fisheries. So hoping to influence marine mammal policy worldwide. It has not been implemented yet. It doesn't start to be implemented until November, I think, of 2022. They've pushed it back a bit because of COVID. So the intent is for that to happen. There are other situations that could happen, such as transfer effect. If a fishery isn't able to enter our market, perhaps they'll sell to other markets that pay less for the seafood, and then they'll have to then fish more and make the problem worse. But we'll see. I'm hopeful, and I'm sure people who came up with it are too.
Excellent. We've got a question that came in from the web from Catherine Raynone, who is a 2019 alum of the program. Did you come across any data that discussed differences in prices in the different products? For example, are the U.S. tuna longline fish more expensive than imports?
Ooh, that's a good question. I didn't focus on that for the intention of this study, but I would imagine in general, if something is harder, like if you have to be more selective or have more mitigation practices, perhaps it would be more expensive. One thing from Seaspiracy that I did agree with is that I think we do perhaps eat too much seafood. So if you're eating a lot of seafood that you're not sure of where it's coming from, or if you look it up and it's rated avoid, maybe instead eat less seafood, but make sure it's coming from sources that you know are sustainable.
Great. And finally, what are the management practices that countries should implement to improve their scores in criterion 3 of your project?
That's another, it depends. We've said this phrase a few times today, but there's no silver bullet. There's no, every fishery should do this to improve and everything will be better. It's really gonna depend on the fishery and the economic status of the country and the thing being caught. And so there's a lot of different mitigation measures, but for some fisheries, I think maybe part of the reason in the US we haven't dealt with bycatch in the way that we could is because it's maybe expensive, and so if the US isn't doing it, other countries that have less money than us also won't be able to do it. So cost is prohibitive. I think fisheries should just do whatever's cheapest and get the ball rolling. Thank you.